Welcome back to Crowns and Chaos. This is going to be episode, I think we're on 6 now. So exciting. We are in the Shadow Alchemy series of this podcast. It is a great foundation, I think, for everything else that we're going to talk on for the next, hopefully, several years to come. And this is my life's work. It's very close to me. And admittedly, it's kind of hard to deliver via podcast. And so this is actually our second recording of the child sovereign pillar, the pillar of vision, because I've spent a lot of time with these. And as anyone knows, when you gain mastery of a thing, sometimes it's really hard to look back and describe it in bite-sized chunks. And so I tend to move at a really high level very quickly and very intellectually. And that didn't serve anybody in the first recording. So we're going to do it again. And we are going to incorporate more of the emotional body and more of the storytelling so that you guys can actually see yourselves in these pillars. So, Sarah, thanks so much for being on and supporting me with this huge project that I'm laying out here. It's admittedly more complex than I initially thought it would be.
Yeah, absolutely. I love talking about these things. So it's no skin off my nose to re-record these things, especially from the lens of the entrepreneur and how these things show up as we're trying to build businesses. I saw a Facebook post today that I screen captured and sent to you, and it was a business coach who's basically like, get a therapist because yes, that work needs to be done, but I'm here to help you make money. And if you got things on your mind that you need to say, like talk to them. And immediately I was like, I mean, I see where she's coming from, but also I don't agree. I think that the part of our work and what makes us so valuable to the people in our lives is that we're not looking at their business from one prism or one perspective, because as you love to say, how you do one thing is how you do all things. And we're going to talk about the child today. If you're showing up as the child in your business, I can see for you what's available in the sovereign. But if I was to ignore that altogether and just say business strategies, business tactics, we're actually not getting anywhere because you're always just going to fall back into these shadows unless we bring visibility and awareness to the source of it, right? And potentially, if I was to boil down everything that we're trying to do here, is we're trying to bring awareness to the 95% of your existence that is hidden to your conscious mind. And so if we can do that little bit by little bit, in shining a light on it or spotlighting kind of these shadows and how they show up, it becomes much easier for us to work with these things. And so as an example, we're going to talk about how one of the shadows of the child is lying or manipulating. This is directly relatable to marketing tactics. And we all know what this feels like. We know it when we see it. We know how it feels in our body, but it comes from the child pillar. And having the ability to share this with the world so that people can catch themselves or to identify it in the real world will make them better business owners and better entrepreneurs. And that's the goal here. So I'm really excited to re-record this and to share just the process of, Crowns and Chaos. It's a little messy. I did the business tarot a couple of days ago, and I shared that the lesson, there was a few days gap. And the lesson there is that, consistency doesn't have to look like posting every day or posting 3 times a week or posting whatever in your business or doing anything the same way all the time. Consistency means continually showing up and measuring against a whole bunch of different factors, but you just keep showing up. And so for us, we're going to keep recording podcasts. Not all of them are going to see the light of day. And so I'm really excited to talk about the child and the sovereign today so that people can kind of see what this looks like when played out.
Yes, yes. And I do want to make a note here. When people come to me, a lot of times they want to do the inner work, the mindset work, the soul deep work. And that's what I live for. For some reason in our society, that doesn't translate to action. And so a lot of people, when they get into a container with me, we do like this beautiful metaphysical work. And then they go, okay, but how? And the answer to that is just action. You just start showing up differently in your world with this new awareness. I think people are waiting for a magic switch. I know I was. The very beginnings of my journey, and even like the middle of my journey, and sometimes even now, I'm like waiting for a magic switch to flip where I learned a thing, and now all of a sudden the whole world looks different. That's not actually how magic works. It's not how mindset works, how any of this works. The magic switch was the awareness. And the magic switch is also in taking different action based on that awareness. And you said something beautifully the other day around leadership, where the process of going from the conscious mind to the unconscious mind, meaning that you're repatterning stories of limitations or patterns of scarcity, potentially, whatever limiting beliefs you have, you're repatterning those. That process comes through repetitive action. And so to bring awareness to something is the first step. But the second step has to be that you now move differently in the world with this new awareness. And so when people are saying, how is that you just go do it differently? You just start showing up differently. When you recognize a shadow is playing out, there's no magic switch that now all of a sudden, because you have the awareness, the world's going to shift. The magic switch is that because you have this awareness, you can choose again. You choose differently this time. So action reinforces the mindset and the stories in the mind that make them habit. And so the action is how we repattern. It's through the repetition of action. Now, action is going to come later in the pillar of the victim and the warrior. That's the next pillar we're going to cover. But we can't take aligned action if we don't have aligned vision. And that's where we're going to start today. All of it starts with the emotional body, and even going back a pillar, your value systems, right? And so we get clear on our values. Today, we're going to get clear on our vision so that tomorrow we can get clear on the action that we're taking that's in alignment with the values and the vision.
We're talking about emotions here. With my coaching clients, I'm continuously walking them through kind of the process of how a thought becomes manifest, or how a thought becomes something that shows up tangibly in the world. And so we start off with the thought, right? We charge it with emotion. And that creates action. And you go and peel open a psychology 101 book, likely they're going to talk about the fact that actions are triggered by emotions. And if you are unaware, your emotional body might be triggered to something like anger, and you punch someone, right? Like you would not have punched someone unless you were triggered by an emotion of anger. And so when we are bringing awareness to how the emotional body triggers action, we can actually look at our world and more consciously decide what actions we're going to take with our conscious mind, knowing that, ooh, I was just triggered. And whether that's a great feeling, right? I was watching Anne with an E last night with my daughter. I cried probably for the first 2 episodes straight. It is just such a gorgeous show. I was moved, and by being moved emotionally, I take action. And, like obviously watching TV, you move to emotion. There's not really a whole lot of action you can take, but our emotional body is what's going to trigger us to show up in the warrior. A lot of this is subconscious because your body speaks a subconscious language. It doesn't have words. And so I just want to bring awareness to that when we're talking about this particular pillar, which is represented in the tarot by the suit of cups, which is, again, emotions, that this is what happens prior to action. It happens after thought, prior to action. And sometimes, might be worth mentioning, you can pass the ball between thoughts and emotions. And we actually talk about that, I think, a little bit later. But if you have ever been kind of struck by analysis paralysis, or if you are someone who likes to dream a lot, even like reading books does this, right? Where you're like reading, which is a very intellectual thing, and then you start crying in a book, you keep reading. You're not actually doing anything with that information. You're just passing it from the suit of swords, which is the intellectual realm, and then the suit of emotions. And you could live there. And a lot of people do. They just live in this space of like thought, emotion, thought, emotion. But to your point earlier, our goal isn't to have you do that. So if you're like, oh, I feel seen today, she's like absolutely speaking to something that I see in my world. The only way to get out of that thought, emotion, thought, emotion, thought, emotion spiral is to take action.
So this is the pillar of vision. The child is the shadow aspect of this pillar, and the sovereign is the light aspect of this pillar. Just a reminder that both pillars are one thing. It's a coin with two sides. And so we can't omit tails because we favor heads. There's a 50-50 chance you're going to land on either. But the more awareness you have of your shadow, the less likely you are to be controlled by it or moved by it on an unconscious level, because you can say, oh, I recognize that pattern. I'm going to choose differently. And so this is the channel of individuation. This happens in children around 2 or 3 years old, and then again when they turn like 11 and 12, and then again when they turn like 20 and 21. And then it keeps on in that cycle. Individuation is basically, I'm separate from my creator. And so children around 2 or 3 start to test limits because they recognize that they're separate from mommy, right? Or they're separate from daddy. And so when you think about individuation, it's quite literally saying, like, how am I unique? How do I separate myself from the collective, from the creator? And of course, we don't want you to stay separate. Everything is one thing, but the separation is what creates art. This is the pillar of vision and identity. Our identity is formed through the stories that we tell about ourselves. And so first it's formed through our system of values. If we inherited those values, it's time to take a look at them and start saying what fits and what doesn't, because potentially you were handed values that didn't fit who you are. And now you have shame because you're not living up to the expectations of your forefathers, right? And so our vision and our identity is quite literally formed through the stories, the patterns, and the beliefs that we have and hold about ourselves. This pillar actually writes the story. This pillar is the myth maker. She is the one who says, this is who I will become. This is who I want to be. This is what I want my business to look like. And then she can hand that off beautifully to the warrior so that the warrior can go take action on making that happen. So today we're going to get clear on your vision, your identity. This pillar is the pillar of decrees and dreams. And so dreams and vision, one and the same. Decrees are only valuable. They only hold weight. They're only worth a shit if you're willing to take responsibility for that which you've decreed so that you can move forward and take action. Otherwise, your words hold no weight. They have no value. You say a thing, but it doesn't mean anything. I'm going to work out every day. And then exactly tomorrow, you don't work out. You know what I mean? And so that decree had no value. It had no weight. And so at that point, you're in the child. And you think about kids say, what is that show from like the 90s? Kids say the darndest things. They
Yep.
just talk about nothing all the time, incessantly. Their voice has no weight yet. In this column, be aware that the archetype, if you need an archetype to reference outside of yourself, your kids are a great example of the child pillar. But for good reason. We want them in their child. But once you're an adult, we don't want you in your child anymore. As Sarah said, this is a column of emotion. And so our emotions are closely linked with how we view ourselves, right? You think about when you look in the mirror, anybody and everybody is going to have this. You look in the mirror, things come up. Whether it's like that you don't like your hair or you don't like your teeth or your mom told you were overweight when you were little. So now you carry that everywhere with you, right? Those things, they all have an emotional charge. It's important to note that if your vision or your identity isn't emotionally charged, it's going to be something that lands for you. And when I say lands for you, I mean it causes an emotional reaction. We want that to be on the positive end. We want you to look at your vision or this new identity that you're writing and be lit up by it. You're excited for it. It does something to you emotionally. There's fire in there.
And on that note, it's not that we never want you to have a negative emotion. It's that when you have a negative emotion, you look at it and say, what is in this for me? What specifically is this telling me? How can I frame it or take action in a way that changes that negative emotion going forward? And a silly example, my daughter had asked me if we could go paddleboarding while my husband was at work. And I was like, I'm not strong enough to get those boards on the roof of the car. I hated that. I'm an athlete. I have been my entire life. And I was like, why am I not strong enough? And so that created this realization in myself that I wanted to get stronger. So the negative emotion I had, I was able to look at and say, what is this negative emotion telling me? And it wasn't like oh, you're, so weak type thing. It was, I feel badly that I'm not strong enough. What can I do, to change that? And there were a couple of things. I could get lighter boards, for example, which is still something that I might do. But for me, what I extracted from that negative emotion was that I wanted to get stronger. And so I hired a personal trainer, and now she comes and we do torture sessions, but I'm getting stronger. And that is how you take a negative emotion and look at it and say, what is in this for me so that the next time this comes up, I don't feel negatively about it.
No positive polys here because the negative emotions are the guru, right? Anytime you have a negative emotion, that's your guru. Like that's your teacher. All shadow contains gold for you. If you're willing to look at it, most people, they want to run away from it. It's uncomfortable. And so then what happens is the cycle of the shadows where you have the prostitute handing to the child, handing to the victim, handing to the saboteur. And again, that puts you in that mental, emotional cycle that Sarah was talking about, where you don't ever see any change in your life. And so we want you in the sovereign so that you can hand off to the warrior and actually, okay, this negative emotion happened. What can I do about it? How can I change this in my life?
A business example of this is I just recently came across a website from someone who is doing a podcast that in the description talks about how it's neuro-based business advice. And I'm like, I love that. That's where I live, is this neuroscience-based understanding of biopsychology, of psychology in general. Like this is gold for me. So I'm looking at her website. I'm like, completely in awe. One could even say there's a little bit of like self-defeat, right? In the fact that like, oh, she's doing everything that I want to do. And she has this gorgeous website. And like, as you know, I've been struggling for like the last year plus, no, 4 years, trying to get my personal website to like really represent kind of who I am, what I do, and how I want to serve. And so like that was a certain trigger, which we see all the time in our business containers, where people come in and they're like, oh, I've got so many competitors and this person just did this or whatever. And like, now do I need to do this? Or we're always working with this particular shadow. But that reflection for me was an opportunity for me to say, okay, well, what about this inspires me? What about this is for me? What about this is a reflection of how I want to show up in the world? And so like we see this all the time in business. There are two options here. You can take it and you can be jealous, or you can take it and you can be activated.
Ooh, I wonder if jealousy lives in this pillar. That's a thought exercise for you and I later on in Telegram. I would say that jealousy probably lives here. My mind could be changed because these are all so fluid, right? The divine feminine and everything teaches us that there's fluidity. I'm going to give you the specifics of the child pillar, but the child pillar is so closely linked to the victim, the lover, that they make up one entity, right? You have four corners that make up one entity. And so it's hard to distinguish sometimes what lives where because it all lives within you, right? And so this is just the very best way, I think, to divvy it up, but it's also fluid.
I mean, yes, we've attached them to the different seasons, right? You don't wake up one day and it's spring and then the next day it's summer. It's a gradual progression from one to the next. And so the same here, they kind of blend and merge into each other like the colors of the rainbow.
Yes, exactly. Delicious. The thought exercises that are available for this column, if you're trying to activate the pillar of the child so that you can look at it and work with it, you want to ask, who am I without the thoughts and opinions and rules of others? Who do I give my power or authority to? Sarah likes to ask this question with business owners. She says, are you giving away your power card? And you can look in your life, who am I giving my power card away to? The child is an actionless dreamer. And so we've covered that pretty well here. They're going to have all the ideas. They're going to have all the dreams. I just wish that I could do, but I can't because my son is doing this, or I can't because the weather, and those excuses that they make actually show up in the next pillar. But for now, know that they have lots of ideas of what they would like to be, but they're not doing anything differently. They're not taking responsibility for those visions. The sovereign turns dreams into reality through the process of taking responsibility for what they've decreed to be so. And so when you rewrite your story, this is the pillar in which you will take full ownership for making that a reality, thus creating your very own myth, right?
We can talk about decrees. An example of how I use this in business is anytime I do a webinar, anytime I'm teaching anything, I start with an oath. And I make sure that people know this oath is not to me. It's not even to the grand creator. This oath is for you to claim in advance of our time together what you're going to take away from this. And it's usually something very tangible. I commit to taking away 3 actionable takeaways that I will then implement into my business. And in business, I'm constantly, to your point, just like handing the power card back to people. We live in a world where there's a lot of things we cannot control. And I like to remind people there's only one thing ever that you can control, and that is what you're paying attention to. Now, whether or not you take action or not, that's another thing that you control, but you're only going to take action on what you're bringing your awareness to and what you're paying attention to. And so I start my teaching containers with an oath because I'm bringing awareness to what I want them to take away from that so that they can then be inspired to take action. And that's a decree, right? So when I have someone take an oath to themselves, they're decreeing, I'm going to do this. Now, whether or not they actually go and do those things is determined on whether they're in their shadow aspects of their pillars or the light aspects of their pillars. But I can do what I can on my end by bringing awareness to what I want them to be bringing awareness to.
This shadow is often showing up preoccupied with what is fair. They expect the world to provide for them and to protect them, whether that's being personified in a partner or in a job or in other relationships in their business. This person is looking out and saying, if everyone else can do it, why isn't it working for me? It could also show up as a belief that that works for others, but it won't work for me.
We also see this when, for example, someone has a call with a potential client and they're like, this sounds great, send me a proposal. And then you send them the proposal and they don't do anything with it. They like ghost you, they never respond. And there could be a response of, I did my end. Like, why aren't they responding back? In reality, they have no obligation to respond back to you, right? That's not something that they have to do. But if you have a sense of it's not fair, they asked me for this, I gave them this, and it's expected that they do this afterwards, that's someone showing up in that shadow aspect of the child.
Yes, the child also needs permission for everything. They need permission to show up big. They need permission to charge more in their business. We do so much of just giving people permission to make money. The number one thing that we support people with is giving them permission to make money from their business. They need permission to sell their business. They need permission to invest in themselves. They've externalized that power card. They can't give their self permission. They need someone else to do it for them. We hear this a lot in sales conversations. It's a beautiful sales tactic where people will say, this sounds like a great investment. I need to ask my husband, or I'm going to need to ask my wife. And the most beautiful rebuttal I've ever used for this is to hold them in their sovereign. And so the difference, the child is going to say, hey, honey, I would really like to make this investment. Is that okay with you? The sovereign is going to say, hey, honey, I would really like to make this investment. Will you support me in this? And so the sovereign is going to go out and source support mechanisms. They're going to create their own resources. The child is going to be asking someone else for permission to even consider the thing. The problem with that is that when someone goes to their spouse in their child, because you're in shadow, you're not a very good salesperson. And so your partner is going to be like, that sounds like a really risky thing. Let's not do that. And so instead you go and ask for support. That's standing your ground. It's saying, this is valuable to me and I need your support with it. And it just has a totally different tone. And the way that your partner receives you is much different. And you'll find this with any sales call, any person that you're interacting with in business. When you show up as the sovereign, there's an entirely different energy in the room. And so the sovereign is going to command respect through the fact that they don't need permission or external validation because they've curated self-trust.
Right. There's an understanding that I am the king and the queen of my own kingdom. I don't need your permission to show up big. I don't need your permission to show up whole. I don't need your permission to hold power in this room. I just do. And sometimes we see this, whether it's in our Facebook group or coaching containers, where someone will say, I did the math and I really need to be charging significantly more for my stuff than I currently am. Is it okay for me to raise my prices? Do I need to let people know that I'm raising my prices in advance? And no, you don't. Like, you owe nobody anything. You can just tomorrow change your prices. And people are always like, there's like this discomfort with being able to show up that way. I'm in, a number of other business containers. And one of the things that I'm always mind blown about, that these very well seasoned business people are really hesitant and reluctant to show up consistently, or I would even say like potentially aggressively in email. And they're like, well, I don't want to annoy people after my follow up. And you're taking the power card away from the person that you're communicating with, right? Let them tell you when they have been receiving too many of these emails. And they can easily do that. They can either unsubscribe or they can respond back and say, hey, I'm not interested in this. Please stop contacting me. And maybe they're afraid of that response, right? Because then they're hitting their child and, oh, mommy doesn't love me type thing, right? But business owners oftentimes will fall into the shadow side of this pillar because they feel like they're an inconvenience, or they feel like they're being annoying, or they're showing up too large, or they need permission to charge more, etc. So these are some of the business ways that we see people fall into that shadow side of this pillar.
And you can look at that first in your own children, but also like in your childhood. Were you closed away as a child? You weren't allowed to express your emotions in the living room. You were sent to your room, right? Were you told you're being too much? Were you told you're annoying? Those things are going to be showing up here for you, because that's, again, all shadow is usually created between 0 or 7. And so we can look back to our childhood and say, who gave me my values? And then who created my self-image? And are you still operating with that self-image, right? I used to do this with my husband all the time. I would like, are you mad at me? Or, hey, are you okay? Are you upset with me? And my husband would always be like, I'm fine. This is my face. And this comes from being a child, and it's not safe when my parents aren't. And I come from a pretty abusive background. Potentially, though, someone who's listening to this also came from a highly abusive or even mildly abusive childhood. Because if you're listening to this, you probably grew up in the 80s and 90s, and it was like commonplace to be abusive. That was just like how people were. And so you can look back and say, like, was it unsafe for you to upset someone or to inconvenience someone? And now that's showing up in your email marketing because you don't want to inconvenience someone. You don't want to be too loud. And to Sarah's point, what you're doing is actually usurping their sovereignty and allowing them to express when they've had enough. Look back to your childhood and in your intimate relationships to see where this is possibly being reflected in your business as well.
I love this example for a couple of reasons, right? Because we're working through the lens of business in a lot of this, but it also is going to hold hands with your personal relationships, which is also going to hold hands with the way that you parent, which is also going to, right? That's why I think I was so flabbergasted at that particular Facebook post today, which was like, get a therapist because I just want to help you make money. It's, in order for you to make money, like we got to look at the way that you're doing all the things, because if you're showing up in your business hesitantly or feeling like you're annoying or bothering people, we're going to look at things that are also probably showing up in your relationships, which are also probably showing up in, other areas of your business and your life.
Exactly. This shadow lies and manipulates to get what they want. And we don't actually see a lot of this because we work with a lot of, I think, honest people. They want to do what's right. And for them, though, it's probably showing up that marketing at all feels like lying and manipulating. And to some degree, I want to break down the word manipulation, because if I take a raw egg and crack it over a hot stove, I put it on the burner, and it becomes a scrambled egg. I have manipulated this egg for breakfast. For breakfast, we're having manipulation. And so all things that are being changed are being manipulated to some degree. The word manipulation gets a really bad rep when it comes from malintent. But we don't work with a lot of people who have malintent. They get stuck because they think marketing in itself is malintent. And we actually teach a very ethical way of marketing and being honest about what it is that you're providing and the subconscious triggers that are available for people to utilize in their marketing in a way that captivates people and inspires them to take action, right? And so if you are someone who feels like marketing is lying or manipulating, and you're somebody who doesn't feel like you have a voice to like market your services, potentially you want to look to the pillar of the child.
If you ever catch yourself being like, hey, look over here, look at me, you're manipulating them by saying, look over here. You were looking over there, and I'm asking you to look over here. That's all manipulation. You're giving someone the opportunity to bring awareness to something that they were not currently bringing awareness to. To your point, like you can do that in a really healthy way. And the fact that people have to make decisions, that's just part of it. Like you have to move through the world, you have to pay attention to something, you have to make decisions. You can either do that in a way that serves someone, or you can do that in a way that serves yourself. And honestly, if you're serving someone, if you're doing good work, it's also serving yourself. It's a win-win situation for everyone. It becomes a win-lose situation when you're using those very same tactics to harm people. The example that everyone likes to use is like the used car salesman, in the fact that like they're going to sell you a lemon, they're going to make you think it's the best car in the world, and they just want it off the lot and they want to make their money. But if that same used car salesman had a lot full of amazing cars, and they used all the same techniques to get people in cars that aligned with their values, did what they needed to do, was within their budget, and all those people drove off the lot, those very same tactics aren't slimy. They're helpful. They helped get someone into a car that served their needs. And so you and I love to say everything in shadow and light. And that's what we mean when we're talking about marketing here, is that you can use the very same tactics to serve someone, or you can use this very same tactics to harm someone. The tactics are not the problem. It's the intention that you have behind it.
Yes. These pillars, once you get really good at identifying them in yourself, are easy to identify in others. But we want to meet people with compassion and hold them in their highest light. If you are stuck in shadow, you will hear these and you will be thinking of other people and you'll be like, oh, my mom does that. Oh, my sister does that. And I would like to reiterate that forgiveness teaches us, which is one of the core ways that we alchemize any of these pillars. And we'll get there in the final episode. Forgiveness reminds us that this person in front of me is in their child, just like me, right? It's okay that that person's in their child. We meet them with compassion and we hold them in their seat of the sovereign. Now, that's going to be wildly uncomfortable for the person that's in front of you, but that's theirs and not yours. They will at some point, if they come to their own light aspects, have great appreciation for the fact that you held them in their highest light. But you'll be able to use these pillars of alchemy in your marketing and sales processes, and you'll be able to spot them in the people that you're supporting, in the clients that you have, in the feedback that they give you, in their responses, and you'll be able to hold them in their light archetypes, which is one of the most ethical and easiest ways to sell people, because you're doing them such a service by holding them in their light archetypes, and they don't realize it either. And maybe you're listening to this and you're like, I sell bar services. I'm probably never going to use the psychology of shadow alchemy, but that's not true, because these can become how you walk in the world. And if you want to stand in the premium market or even the luxury market, it's pivotal for you to be in your light archetypes. And it's even more pivotal for you to be able to spot and hold others in their light archetypes so that you create relationships that are aligned, right? If you have somebody who's refusing to pay an invoice and you're like going back and forth about it a bunch, there's shadow happening there. And potentially that shadow is obviously for you because it's before you, but also potentially that shadow could have been avoided had you engaged through the light archetypes to begin with. And so we want to help you avoid creating a shadow entity as a business. And if you already have a shadow entity as a business, we want to help you transmute it to a light archetype business so that you can move in the world in an aligned way that serves you, that's prosperous, where your marketing is holistic and it's ethical, where your sales tactics and techniques bring out the very best in your potential clients. That's our goal here.
Yeah. Some of the things that we see, for example, are people who are like, well, I want to be affordable. Affordable to whom? That's a word I would love every business owner to absolutely remove from their vocabulary, because affordable is so subjective. If I'm a 7-figure business owner, a $50,000 a year mastermind is affordable to me. And so for them to be looking at my website and be like, $50,000 for a mastermind, that's insanely expensive. This is nowhere near affordable. There's just too many variables as to what affordable is. And yet we see consistently people who are like, well, I'd like to be affordable and serve people that couldn't necessarily afford these other competitors that are in the market. And to that, I'm like, why? Are we looking to just do good work in the world? Like, what's the value that we hold around, quote unquote, affordability? If you're ever in a Facebook group or talking to someone and they're like, I don't know how y'all get away with charging these prices for this thing, like that person is clearly in the shadow aspect, because if people are willing to pay these prices, then let them. They have their own sovereignty. I think it's important for us when we talk about these things to realize that there's nothing wrong with the person in the Facebook group that's like, I don't know how you guys are getting away charging these things. I'm going to let him or her feel that way. I'm just not going to teach my clients that. And if they came into one of our group coaching containers and said that same thing, I would be like, here's your power card back, because if someone's willing to pay those prices, then let them. Who are you to say that's too expensive? There are first class seats in an airplane and there are coach class seats in an airplane. And if someone's willing to pay first class, that doesn't mean anything about that person other than that's what they value.
This is not on the list, but it came up as you were talking. The child is going to usurp sovereignty of others, right? Or they're going to try. You can't actually usurp someone's sovereignty, but if you're in the victim, then everyone's usurping your sovereignty, right? The child is going to attempt to usurp the sovereignty of others. And this actually happens if I have any light workers or healers or metaphysicians on the call. This is rampant in the new age spiritual communities where like we just feel we have to give everyone our medicine, whether they asked for it or not. And sure, like you're allowed to be who you are, but unsolicited advice, there's a fine line there between them being fully self-expressed and them attempting to get me to believe their way of life. When I see that shadow, what it looks like to me is that the healer or the practitioner, the person who is attempting to give everyone their medicine, whether they ask for it or not, is actually really insecure in what they believe to be true. And they need other people to validate them by practicing and believing the same way they believe. And so, one of the things that's super toxic in the personal development community right now is just cut people out. If someone doesn't believe the same way you believe, cut them out.
Your peace, right?
Yeah, protect your peace. Exactly. And the thing is that if you're constantly protecting your peace, you don't actually have peace, because peace and protection are opposing words. If you have to protect your peace, you don't have
You're at
peace.
war.
You're at war. Exactly. Exactly. And so if you are just out here like, let me just cut people out left and right, you're only doing a disservice to yourself, because again, the negative emotions, the triggers are your guru. That was an opportunity for you to learn and hone within yourself and create peace within yourself. And so sure, sometimes it is important to cut people out. I'm not saying that this is an extreme and that you should never, if someone's toxic in your life, you know, or they're abusive, sure, leave that person, do what you need to do. But if you're just out here like, oh, well, you're a Republican, we can't be friends, then you're not growing. You're insecure in what you believe to the extent that you have to isolate yourself with people who believe the same thing that you believe. That's not stability. That's not knowing. And when you have knowing, you can take that confidently anywhere. And when someone challenges you, you can say, okay, do I really know this thing? Do I really value this thing? And if so, because I'm triggered, how can I do the work of expressing this knowing and standing more firmly in it? Because obviously there's a crack in the foundation somewhere.
One of the things that came up for me while you were talking, and this is a business-based podcast, but you talk about the light workers and all of the Reiki energetic professionals out there come to mind, in that like the one thing that I want everyone to know is that no one can heal you. Only you can heal you. And a good practitioner, and I'm talking a good doctor, a good optometrist, a good therapist, right? They're just handing the power card back to you over and over and over again. We have found through studies that if someone comes to you and you're a doctor and you give them hope and you encourage them to believe that like their body is a powerful thing and that the intelligence will do its thing, your chances of getting better are so much better, including even like the famous placebo effect, right? Where they just give you a sugar pill. The placebo is the most repeatable and most successful drug in the world. It just is. It heals more people in more studies around the world than any of the drugs that they've actually tried. That might be a really bold, ambitious statement. There might be one thing out there, like insulin saves people more than placebos. I totally get that. But it is the most repeatable effect and proven way to heal people in study after study, because the body is so capable, right? The body is so capable. And so, we can't overlook the fact that oftentimes people out here are peddling their healing modalities and how special and magical they are. And oftentimes the thing that does the most good is a placebo effect. And it is just the promise that you are capable of getting better. And so if you're a healer and you just continuously hand the power card back to someone, you're just reminding them, yeah, you can hold your hands over them and hold space. That's basically what you're doing, is you're holding space for the next 30 minutes or 45 minutes to focus on healing whatever it is that is wrong with you. That's where all the healing comes from. It's kind of like when a mom kisses your boo-boo and it feels better.
Yeah, as a Reiki master teacher who no longer practices, this was pivotal for me because I felt like I was going to be able to heal the world. And actually, in my initial stages of awakening to shadow and light and the one story, I felt the need that everybody needed to see the world the way I saw it. And so becoming a Reiki master teacher was going to help me do that because I could just heal people. The problem is that even if I am a spinal surgeon and you have really shit posture all your life and you come in to get your spine worked on and I work on it and I send you back into your life without teaching you how to stand correctly or hold yourself in good posture, chances are that within the next few years, you're going to have the same problem again, right? And so you have to change the environments. And the only person who can do that is the person with spinal issues. Not to say that like illness doesn't occur and that there aren't people who are suffering, but to say that like, to what extent are we participating in our own suffering? That's always the first place to look, right? And so I don't want to negate that there's suffering or illness in the world, but I do want to say that dis-ease, the word dis-ease means that you lack ease in your life, right? And so where are you creating dis-ease? And potentially it's in your lineage, it's in your genetics. But now we have epigenetics that is telling us that gene expression, it's not always 100%. There are ways that you, through the merging of the mental, emotional, and action bodies, you can create vast amounts of change in the way that your genes express.
And that actually does tie us all the way back to what we're talking about here, and the fact that like this is the pillar of vision, envisioning. And so we can utilize vision-based techniques to make changes in the body, whether it's disease, whether it's discomfort, whether it's anxiety, whether it's whatever it is, right? These mindfulness techniques that we talk about. I was just reading a science-based book that talked about how resistance to having certain thoughts. I'll just go straight for the punch here. But if you were to tell a teenager not to think about sex, like that's sinful, like studies show that resisting thoughts can lead to cancer. Like it can lead to actual physical bodily results just by telling yourself not to have a specific thought, right? And so that resistance in your body shows up physically. And so much of the work that can be done in the world that I don't necessarily think modern medicine does enough with is this recognition that when we see disease, it's the end stages of something that's been building up for a long time in the mind and in the emotional body.
If I tell you, don't think about a monkey, what mental image did you just have? You know what I mean? All right. So this shadow resists decisive action. That one's hard to say really fast. Resists decisive action. You find this person cycling or mentally masturbating. They're just thought feeling, thought feeling, thought feeling, and there's no action because it would require them to pick a side. And so this shadow is always straddling the fence. This shows up heavy with entrepreneurs who like have all the dreams and all the visions that they're not yet taking responsibility for or that they're not willing to take responsibility for. And so they just cycle between what's possible for them and where they currently are without ever actually taking action to move them in that direction.
I was at an entrepreneurial gathering years ago, it was right before I had started Bar Magnolia, I believe. And they had like a few of the mentors in the room. And someone said, well, I have this business idea and I'd love to discuss it with you, but I don't want to do it in this container. I'd prefer to speak it only to people who have signed an NDA. And the dude was basically like, then I don't want to hear it. And he's like, what? And he's like, because an idea is worth nothing. Like everybody has ideas and ideas aren't worth anything. And the idea that you have for your business is probably not unique. It's probably either been tried before or exists somewhere else. I'm not interested in signing an NDA to hear your idea. And I was like, damn, that was really harsh. But then I've thought about that. And it's so true, right? Like, how many times do you hear people? I myself was like, oh, I had that idea. And now this person's making $1 million off it because your idea is worth absolutely zero, right? It's only the implementation of those ideas that are actually worth a thing.
And ideas are not yours. So we can talk about the electromagnetism of thoughts for a second, and that they are a web that exists without human interface. Now, one of the actually notes that I made on this pillar was that thoughts are things, they're their own entity. It's like radio waves, right? Radio waves existed far before we were using them to play music on the radio. But without the proper equipment, that radio wave cannot be expressed. Okay. And so you are the proper equipment. Thoughts are just happening in their own realm. Ideas are happening. This is why you see the invention of the light bulb happened simultaneously in like 4 different places on the planet. And not just the light bulb, so many different inventions. It's like they drop into the collective and like 4 or 5 different people will pick them up at the same time. And this is why too, like when you have an idea of a thing, now you look into your field, somebody on your Instagram started a coaching container or a business container with that exact name. And it's because that idea wasn't yours. You don't own ideas, you don't own thoughts. Thoughts are being expressed through you, and you get to decide which thoughts are valuable enough for you to take action on.
I can't tell you how many conversations you and I have had about a thing, and then a coach newsletter that you and I both subscribe to will drop into our inbox and like explain that very same thing. And it's like, oh, okay, that's in the collective at the moment.
This bullet I have from way back that says expects gifts or favors, but as I've grown and as I've learned and as these pillars have evolved for me, I would say that this shadow has expectations. They have expectations of how other people show up in the world. They have expectations of what their business will do. I think it was the Buddha that said that the desire is the root of all suffering. I would say expectation is the root of all suffering. Not that I know more than the Buddha, but in our modern day and age, desire is a powerful force. It's a beautiful force. Expectation is the word that we have now. I think that better describes that. Expectations are the root of all suffering in business and in relationships. And this shows up in marriages all the time when I work with couples or I work with women on their marriage where they have an expectation of their husband and their husband isn't meeting that expectation. And so it kills the erotic pillar in their relationship. And when you don't have the erotic, when you don't charge the erotic in a relationship, the creativity and the juice between the two of you will die. Part of that is that you have unrealistic expectations of your partner because your partner is sovereign and they're allowed to just be who they're being. When you have expectations of them, you're asking them to fit into a mold. You're saying, who I think you should be is better than who you are. And who performs well under those conditions?
We see this in business, not just in partnerships, wherein there's the formation of the partnership where you do lay out expectations and you say, okay, if we're going to combine in this way, which I think we see sometimes in like marriages and stuff too, where you do like that premarital counseling where you're like, okay, well, how many kids do y'all want? And have you talked about if this happens? And this is probably trying to align expectations, but like the person you are when you're like 27 years old, that's how old I was, is a lot different than when you're 41 years old and almost 42 years old, right? And so having that conversation before you get married is all fine and good, but like at some point you're going to have a different, you're going to be a different person. And so in businesses, we see this too, not just with like the formation of partnerships where it's like, okay, you're going to come in 50-50 and I'm going to contribute this and you're going to, yeah, okay, great. Setting of those expectations, but also when we are creating containers for people to work with us. And then that includes both client and employees. I talk all the time about setting expectations and holding people accountable. And when you are confining and defining, Expectations are actually really important because you want to let people know, what are you going to get within this container? Where you sit in the child is where you're like, well, what I do looks different for every person. And then when someone's like, hey, I thought I was getting this, and then you're like, I didn't say that. There's just this squishiness around the container. The sovereign is like, this is what you're getting. This is the expectation. Not only am I going to set this expectation, I'm going to hold myself accountable to it. And if you come in and you say this, I'm going to hold you accountable to this, right? That's the sovereign. The child is when like things are squishy and there's not a whole lot of boundaries. And you almost, if there a boundary that was invisible to everybody is crossed, now there's a situation and you're like, oh, I feel hurt, or oh, they didn't pay on time, or whatever. And it's usually a communication and expectations gap.
All things in shadow or light. Expectation is a powerful tool when you are defining and confining, to your point, which defining and confining is how we create in the physical world. And so it is required that you set boundaries for a thing or limits to a thing for it to be made physical, right? Like this desk that I'm sitting at here doesn't go on and on forever. It's not super swampy and like fluid all the time. I am relying on the fact that it's going to hold its structure for the duration of this podcast so that you guys don't hear like liquid desk happening in the ethers in the background, right? And so we have to define and confine, and expectations can be a beautiful way to do that. Expectations run rampant when we are using them as a means to usurp people's sovereignty, to disrupt people's value systems, when we're asking other people to conform to our expectations of reality. No one is responsible, we're in the pillar of responsibility, for your expectations but you. And so even if you set expectations in a marriage and someone, your partner doesn't meet those expectations, what are you going to do about it? And the answer, my friend, is not to continue to nag about the dishes. You know what I mean? Like you have to adjust. Is the marriage worth you doing your own damn dishes because you want them done? Or are you going to adjust and like maybe you need a new partner, right? And so expectations, all things in shadow or light.
Or maybe you hire someone, right? Like there's problem solving that can be had, but it doesn't look like nagging. It looks like, okay, we have a situation here. I would like the dishes to be done. I can do them these amounts of times because of whatever availability, how are we going to problem solve? Are you going to show up and do more of that? Are we going to hire someone to do more of that? There are options here. And ultimately, yes, maybe you get a new partner that likes to do dishes, but the issue is not the partner. The issue is that you want dishes done.
And how are you going to take responsibility for doing the dishes? So many times women are like, well, his mom just did them for him when he was a kid. And so now he never does the dishes. And now, and like, how is that helping? How is me knowing that his mom did the dishes for him helping? Did that do your dishes? So this shadow is also fixated on black or white, either or, right or wrong. So they have a hyperfixation with polarity. When we get to the sovereign, you'll see that they are multidimensional. They understand that all things are multifaceted. There's no I'm right and you have to be wrong. This pillar is the birth of hierarchy. And when we create a hierarchy, whether that looks like putting other people on a pedestal or putting ourselves on a pedestal, we are doing a disservice to reality. I'll give you an example when it comes to my own journey with weight loss. I started following mid-size, plus-size creators so I could feel good about myself because I saw myself represented in other women. And that made me feel good about myself until Victoria's Secret was like, do you want a new bra? And I was like, oh, wait, actually, I feel like shit about myself. And so what I had done there didn't actually fix the problem. I was like, if I see myself represented in this beautiful, voluptuous woman, then I can be happy about my own body. And representation is so important. So don't get me wrong here, okay? And also, because I had to put us on a pedestal, I was making myself subservient to something else. And so then when I was reminded that Victoria's Secret models are a size 0.5, at that stage, now I'm subservient. And so anytime we put ourselves in a hierarchy, whether it's that we're judging our partner in business or we're making ourselves I see a lot of people will be like, I just work with idiots. There's no good people. You can't find good people anymore to hire. And what you're doing there is you're making yourself superior by making someone else inferior. The problem with that matrix is that when you make yourself superior, you are by default also making yourself inferior to anything and anybody else. Now, whoever has a fantastic team, you're inferior to them. What's wrong with me, right? And so the point is to be multifaceted and to understand that it's not always black and white. You're not in a hierarchy somewhere. Everyone and everything is equal. My daughter's like, am I special? I'm like, to me, you're very special. And everyone is special, but nobody's special. And so instead, let's use the word unique because everyone is unique and that's what makes them special, but no one's actually special in that they're on a hierarchy, right? We want to dismantle the pyramid here.
Anybody who's really good at something is really bad at something else. Everyone has facets, and you're going to, shine really brightly over here, and you're going to struggle over here. And that's, the spice of life.
So this shadow isn't taken seriously. This shows up in leadership heavy. It probably also shows up in partnerships like marriages and things like that, but they're not taken seriously because they don't take themselves seriously. And so if you're in the child and you don't act on your decree, you don't respect your own word, your own authority, you don't walk in alignment with your own values and your own vision, then how can you expect to lead others? Now, in our reality, we have been made to believe that there is a such thing as separation. And so the thoughts that are within my head, you'll never know. And so you might think that when you show up to a leadership position and you put on your leadership jacket and you're ready to lead your team, that other people aren't going to know that you're built on a faulty foundation. And even though you said you were going to work out every day this week, you didn't, but they will because it's exuded. Energy is not separate. And so while we do have conscious communication with words, that's 5% of how we're communicating. And guys, we keep saying 5%, but 5% might actually be too generous because it's more probably like 1%. You have 1% conscious expression through words. 99% of your expression is coming from your emotional body, how you carry yourself, how you envision yourself, the values that you hold, which is why the shadow work is so important because it is the 99%. And so if you're out of alignment with your own integrity, then when you show up as a leader, you might be saying nice things with your words. You might be a great leader with the spoken word, but people are going to follow you based on the 99% of how do you lead yourself when no one's watching.
You and I were talking about this before we went live. And the King of Cups is the, I think, embodied kind of archetype of this particular pillar. And I mentioned at that time that the King of Cups is a master of their emotions. It doesn't mean they never get angry. It's that they don't show up angrily. And so a silly example, if you wanted to look at it, is that like a King of Cups, someone who's mastered this pillar, is going to get triggered, but they're not going to take that trigger out on their people. And so a leader in this example might get angry at an employee or might get angry at a client, but they're not going to come back and be manipulative or accusing, or they're not going to punish them. I mean, not that there isn't need for disciplinary action in some cases, but they're not going to do it from a place of triggered. They're going to do it from a place of, okay, I'm a little upset about this. I'm mad. I'm not going to take this out on this person or this community because I'm mad. They have a mastery of their own emotions when it comes to leadership. And they've gotten to a place where they are recognizing what they do needs to be in alignment with their values and not at the whim of emotions, which are fluid. Right now I'm angry, so I'm not going to respond. Right now I'm angry, so I'm not going to discipline them. I'm going to wait until I've come to a stasis point, and then I'm going to communicate with somebody or this person or this community as to why this thing was either in alignment with our values or not in alignment with our values. If you think about the King of Cups, you're not perfect at this point. You've just created mastery around how you utilize your emotions to take action.
A tangible practice that might be helpful for people is that emotions are meant to be metabolized. They are meant to be digested, and we don't think of it like this. We oftentimes an emotion comes up and we're like, we shouldn't be feeling that, shove it back down, right? Or an emotion comes up and it's just all hell breaks loose. We've reached our limit and we can't help but just like spew that emotion out into the world. That's because you have unprocessed emotions. And so people are like, Dawn, how do I process emotion? You digest it, you metabolize it. And so what that looks like is when the emotion comes up, you are looking at where do I feel this in my body, not why. Okay. As soon as you go why, you've jerked yourself back up into the 1% conscious brain. We want you to do where, how, when, all these other investigative tools. Where do I feel this in my body? Okay, it's happening in my chest. What does it feel like in my chest? It feels like fire. It feels tight. I feel restricted in my chest. And we're going to just breathe into it. And the emotion will pass. And emotion is energy in motion. And on a less metaphysical scale, it is quite literally chemicals happening in your brain and in your body. It's a chemical reaction. And so we want to digest it by sitting with it, allowing it to move through the body. Energy in motion, it wants to be in motion. It wants to be fluid. It wants to come and it wants to pass. When you say, I'm not supposed to feel this right now, or this isn't a bad time, we shove it down. That causes cancer in the body. It causes dis-ease and illness, right? And so processing your emotion is a journey of looking at where is it happening in my body? What does it feel like? And then potentially doing breath work with it, like just breathing through it and allowing it to run its course. Most emotions are going to last about 1 to 2 minutes. If you have an emotion that's lasted 12 years, that's because it's not being metabolized. You're not digesting it. You're constipated. You're emotionally constipated. And so it's coming out as dysregulated. You're not shitting for 3 days and then you're shitting for an entire day straight because that emotion isn't being metabolized properly.
Awesome example of this. It was a clip that I watched of a baseball player, and they came up to him afterwards and they're like, basically asked a question of like, how do you feel about that game that you just played? And he was very honest. And he's like, I feel like shit about that game. And I don't remember the guy's name, but then he's like, well, what time is it? And they gave him the time and he's like, all right, well, I'm going to let myself feel like shit about this thing for the next 16 minutes and then we'll move on. And like, yes, there's something here to be said. Like sometimes you don't have the ability to process those emotions in that moment. And that's part of becoming an adult and learning to regulate and self-regulate your emotions. And the fact that like, this is not the time or place for me to process this. So I am just, going to bottle that for a minute and I'm going to do what I need to do in this moment. But when you never get around to processing your emotions, that's when it becomes a problem, right? If you're just refusing to look at it and refusing to process and metabolize, that's when it becomes a problem. I don't want anyone to think that we're saying like in real time, you must process all emotions because that's just not the way the world works. But you do need to process them. And ideally, the first available safe space that you have. And we see kids do this when they go to school and they have to, do all the things and keep their shit together and listen and pay attention, or they might get, my daughter had like this little clip down thing. She's like terrified of being clipped down for bad behavior or talking too much or whatever. And then as soon as they get home, they fucking melt. They melt and you're just like, Jesus, my kids are just like why are they such monsters? And it's because that's the first safe container they've had to process all their big emotions that they've had all day. And like, amazing. We need more of that from adults.
Yes, more safe spaces for adults to process. I have a note here for discipline. So this shadow feels out of control internally. Potentially they're emotionally constipated and they lack clear vision. And so they don't take ownership for themselves. And that shows up in a number of ways, but I see it often with overly masculine women, like women who are heavy in their masculine energy, is through controlling other people. And you can't actually do that. So there's just like this constant expectation disappointment cycle that happens, but they attempt to control other people. And that's because they lack self-discipline. Our Lord and Savior Kevin Gates says that self-discipline is self-respect. So when we are disciplined first within, it is how we show that we respect ourselves. And this goes all the way back to like the leadership thing, like they're not taken seriously. If I'm not internally disciplined, I want to be clear here. It doesn't have to look like rigid, I'm going to post every day for 10 days. It can just look like I'm going to make a commitment to myself. I'm going to try it out and I'm going to adjust it as needed to find what works for me and what is in alignment with my values and my internal cycles, right? And so discipling within is a process of controlling what you can. And then you don't need to control or own or possess what other people are doing.
One thing that you control, right? Your attention and your responses and how you show up in the world, right? That's it. What you focus on and how you use your little vessel, your body to create.
They also blame others. And this bleeds beautifully into the victim pillar. My daughter has this thing. She like runs into the door casing and she's like, Mommy, the door casing hit me. Okay, that's not how that works. And so I'm like, come sit with me. I'll hold you while we have a conversation about ownership and responsibility because the door casing within the laws of physics cannot jump out and hit you. And so the child is going to be blaming others. They're going to blame the weather, they're going to blame the market, they're going to blame their competitors. It's everyone else's fault why I'm not succeeding at this. The problem with that is that it pulls you out of the self, it pulls you out of what you can control. And so then you have no power there, right? Like that's part of handing back your power card is that you're owning it. You're owning your life, you're owning your actions, your choices.
We can also see the child being intentionally harmful. And I gave you this example before we got on the call, is that there was a business owner who was dealing with other business owners and didn't like the way that the engagements were rolling out. And instead of handling it like a sovereign individual, they started leaving negative reviews on business pages. That is being intentionally harmful. This person had never received services from their clients, but they were punishing their clients for not being 100% satisfied with their work by leaving fake negative reviews on other people's pages. That's someone who's very clearly showing up in the child. What a childish thing to do. I mean, it's pretty obvious, even just by looking at behavior like that, that someone is in their child. And even when you see people take to like social activism, where maybe an employee shows up a certain way at a fast food restaurant, maybe they are transgender and they are, deep voice, but they are dressed like a woman, and the, community comes in and then starts leaving all sorts of negative reviews for that fast food restaurant because they have an employee that doesn't align with their values. Very much in child, very harmful to others.
The child also compares and mimics. This is because they're out of alignment with their values. And moving forward, you'll see that they're out of alignment with their ability to create from space. All creation comes from nothing. The process of moving through these 4 archetypes or through the 4 seasons or through the 4 suits of the tarot is the process of the nothing becoming the something. First, you have a thought. Somebody had to think, wow, I would really like to have somewhere to sit and work that wasn't my dining room table. Boom, the desk was born. And so that's a thought first. It evokes an emotion that then evokes action. And then that action becomes a physical reality. When we have someone who's comparing and mimicking, it's because they're out of alignment with who they are, their own desires, their own thoughts, and their own creativity. And so all they can do is look outside of themselves and say, I'll take that swipe file. I like that business model. I'll utilize that branding. And all things in shadow are light, okay? Because sometimes I don't care enough to create an entire 25 template design for our Instagram. It's easier for me to just go buy it. But I'm not comparing and mimicking at that point. I'm just making an executive decision. That's not worth my time and energy right now, or I'm not very good at that. I'll have someone else do it. When you're in the child, this looks like not being able to create your own ideas or not being able to birth your own ideas into the world. And so you need to go outside of yourself and say, what is that person doing? On the comparison side, they're looking outside and they're saying, my competitor prices this way. I need to price this way. Or if I don't price this way, does it mean I'm too expensive or does it mean I'm too cheap? And so comparing and mimicking comes in with the child. My daughter, she loves to play copying mom. All kids do this. No other way. That's how they formulate who they are in the world, is to compare themselves to mom or to compare themselves to other people in the environment and to mimic what they see. But as a sovereign, you recognize that you get to create at will the patterns and programs and visions and values that you hold. And so if you are still holding true to values that your parents had and that the generation before them had, as opposed to creating your own values, potentially you're in the child, and you'll know because those values don't actually fit. And so then you're constantly comparing yourself to those values and saying, I'm not good enough. Something's wrong with me because I can't not think about sex ever in my entire life. And nothing's wrong with you. You just need to adjust your values. That's where the sovereign comes in. The child is just going to say, those are the values of someone else. They must be my values as well.
On that note, they change with the environment that they're in. And then I think that's kind of what you were getting at with claiming the values of other people. So if you know a business that is constantly changing their business model or constantly changing their pricing or constantly changing their services based on, well, I went to this webinar or I started using this person's methodology or whatever. Now, sometimes you can play, right? You can play as a child, you can try new things and you can see what works. But at some point, you have to actually be like, okay, this works, and this is how I'm going forth. The shadow side of that is when it's shiny object syndrome, and raising my hand here because I've gone through this process with my businesses in that someone's always selling a thing that works. And it wasn't until I had a call with a coach, which I do think it's important to learn from those that have been, to be instructed by. We can all be a child. We can all be absorbing information and we can all take things from the world around us that we want to emulate. But this coach basically was, I'm like, I just can't find the magic pill. He's like, well, you've tried all the things at this point, Sarah, and they've all worked. They've all worked. So just pick one and stick with it. And I was like, mind blown. That was the prescription there. But like, I was very much in my child at that moment, in the fact that like, whatever the next best thing was the way. I was just mimicking a lot of what was available out there because I assumed that someone else was sovereign. Someone else knew more than I did. Someone else was, doing the best thing. And one of the lessons that I've learned in business is that you can pretty much create any product, any service, price it any way that you want, package it any way that you want, and it'll sell. There's enough people in the world, over 8 billion of them, that as long as you're aligning what you're providing to their value set, people will spend money on it. So there is no magic bullet, right? It's just like, choose a thing and do that. And that's where you kind of wear the crown, the CEO hat, and you just pick a thing and you go all in on it and make it yours.
Yeah, what I teach, these pillars, I learned from a mentor who learned from a mentor who learned from a mentor who learned them from Carl Jung. These aren't original, and I've taken them and molded them into my modality after studying occult and esoteric ideals for the last 12 years. But none of those were original either. How I express them, that's mine. That's the sovereign. So to some extent, we want to compare and we want to mimic to find out what we like in the world. But it's so that we can create something unique, not so that we can just copy and paste. This shadow also needs to be held accountable. This is such a nuanced topic. The child is not in integrity when no one is watching. And so the child needs someone. They're like, I have to have an accountability buddy or I'll never work out. I have to have an accountability buddy or I'll never do this thing in my business. And that can be a very powerful tool. It can also be a thorn in your side because you should absolutely be able to hold yourself accountable. And in fact, no one else can hold you accountable. Now, part of holding yourself accountable can be employing systems of accountability. And Sarah, that's where you come in. That's what you're doing right now with your your workout routine, your personal trainer.
Absolutely, 100%. And that's also what we offer in our business coaching containers, our systems of accountability. And there's a book out there, and the book is escaping me, but the author basically breaks down, everybody fits into one of 4 different categories. And I don't remember exactly what she calls it, but as I read it, it's basically like 4 ways of people being held accountable. And one category, which is the smallest amount of people in the world, they're just really inherently, innately good at holding themselves accountable. They say a thing, they do a thing. And then there are 3 other subsets of people that require different things in order to achieve things. And we're a community. We are pack animals. Like we very much rely on a number of different ways, the people in our lives, in order to show up and do things, right? And so like one of the ways that you can be held accountable is by being with someone else, just in the same space. We see this sometimes, I think this kind of moved through the ADHD community, where they are like, I just need you to sit in the room with me so I can clean my room. Or I just need you to come shopping with me so that like I can go grocery shopping, right? It's a little hack because they realized about themselves that they will do a thing they know that they want to do or need to do if someone else is literally just there. So there's all sorts of programs online now where you can co-work with people virtually. You literally just sit in a Zoom room and you do work, because being in the presence of people doing work will inspire me to do work, right? Telling someone that you're going to do a thing oftentimes will help people do a thing. And so there's systems that increase people's accountability. This is still wearing the hat of the sovereign, the crown, right? Knowing that you need a certain thing in order to show up a certain way, that's not a detraction from your ability to do things. It's only when you've decided to do nothing and people who are like, I'm so disorganized, and they take no action to become organized or to figure out what works for them in order to accomplish things. That's where we're in the child, right? But when you can look out into the world and say, I operate best, in my case with my personal training, I operate best not by saying, I'm going to go join a gym, because now I got to go to the gym. So I know about myself. I needed Renata to be in my house, showing up at scheduled times for me to be like, okay, I'm going to go put my workout outfit on and I'm going to do this thing. Like I will run all day long. I don't mind that. I'm very self-driven when it comes to that. But strength training, I need someone to be in the room telling me exactly what to do, how many reps, counting for me in order for me to do those things. There's nothing wrong with that. I know that that's what I need in order to do those things. I'm still in the sovereign by relying on systems of accountability.
So the sovereign we've touched on 100 times already. It's pretty much the inverse of the child. But to give you guys an idea of some of the things that maybe weren't touched on as clearly in the child and how they show up in the sovereign, we're going to move into that now. So the sovereign expresses self-mastery through radical responsibility. And when I say radical, guys, I mean radical responsibility. If you really want to play in the realm of radical responsibility, I recommend red magic for Christians who have an open mind, or witches who have an open mind, or whatever religion you are. If you're open-minded, open-hearted, the book The Way of Mastery, I have read it 15 times cover to cover. I will read it again because it is so powerful. It's such a powerful meditative tool on what it looks like to take radical responsibility. Okay. So taking full responsibility for making your dreams a reality. What you decree, you must then hand to the warrior and claim with your actions. Before you can hand your decree to the warrior, you must take radical responsibility for your creation. This pillar is not concerned with what is fair. They create clarity. At first, when I had this down from the many years ago that I taught it, I had it down as has clarity. Since then, I have grown and I have learned clarity is something that we create. Now, it can be gifted to you through a process of creating space. Okay, but you're still creating it. And so, if you need clarity, fasting is a tool that you can utilize to create that clarity. Fasting doesn't just necessarily have to be with food. You can fast from technology, you can fast from certain behaviors, you can go on a retreat and fast from your business or from your normal world to create clarity. Check out Brew, our business revitalization and empowerment retreat that is happening in 2025 if you need a retreat to create clarity. But changing where you are, changing your location, changing your mindset, changing up your patterns and behaviors is how you create clarity when you don't have it. And clarity is in the gut, it is in the emotional body. And so when you are emotionally dysregulated, if you are like, I feel like I'm all over the place, I hear that all the time with entrepreneurs. They're like, I just feel like I'm all over the place. Creating clarity is a process of fasting from whatever is causing you to lack clarity. And sometimes that could be just that you're overeating. I know whenever I lack clarity and I feel a little down, I'm like, give me all the sugars. I want all the zebra cakes. You know what I mean? But that's not creating clarity. It's actually clogging. The emotional body needs to move. It needs to be in motion. And so if we're emotionally constipated, there isn't clarity in the body, right? And so to create clarity, you can employ fasting in different measures. Sometimes that looks like I'll be in the bedroom for the next hour meditating and journaling to find my source to go within. Clarity is something that's created
and requires space.
Yes. Yeah. Whether that be space in your diet, space in your emotional body, space in your physical world, create space. This light archetype takes decisive action with the recognition that they probably will fail, but they're willing to accept the consequences of that failure in order to extract the gold that failure provides. Okay. Because all failure is opportunity for learning. It's only considered failure if you don't extract the wisdom that was available for you in that process. If you can extract the wisdom from that process, it's no longer failure. It's a learning experience. Okay. The sovereign is going to take decisive action with the understanding that mental masturbation is of no value to them. Sitting and considering multiple possibilities or multiple routes of failure or multiple scenarios in your head does absolutely nothing in moving the physical vessel. And so they're going to be out in the body taking action in order to find out. They are literally going to fuck around and find out. And that's how they learn and that's how they grow. And some of the most successful people that you see in business say, I spent the first 7 years of my business failing so that I could do this correctly.
The other thing that I want to point out, as the King of Cups here, mastery over emotion, they also will take full ownership over the repercussions of their actions on other people, with the recognition that some actions are not going to please everyone, and they're willing to take that consequence. I'm going to do this thing because it's in the best interest of whatever it is I'm trying to achieve. Some people are going to be pissed off about it. Some people are going to be hurt about it. Some people are going to whatever. And that even means mistakes, right? So I'm going to take full responsibility over this thing that I did that was a mistake. This thing that I did that hurt people or led to negative consequences. I recognize that's what happened. I understand that it negatively impacted people. That's on me.
They're also making these decisions and taking decisive action without seeking permission. And so they may seek support, which happens in the warrior where we're gathering resources, but they're not going to be seeking permission. They are sure in who they are. The sovereign is sure in who she is. And so this isn't who you will always be. You don't have to be in a locked box figuring out who you are for eternity, but they're true and sure of who they are in this moment. They speak their truth and they speak it powerfully, and they recognize that their truth may change from day to day. I've been studying these archetypes for 5 years, 6 years now. Just in this last week, I've grown and these archetypes have changed for me. And so my truth today and how I would coach someone today is different than how I would have coached someone 2 weeks ago. And so I don't need permission to change. I don't need to go out into the world and let every client I've ever had know that I've learned something and now my methodology has changed. I just have to know that people who found me 2 weeks ago needed that version of my medicine. And people who find me 2 weeks from now will need whatever version of my medicine exists 2 weeks from now. But I'm going to speak my truth and I'm going to speak it with authority now, just as I did 2 weeks ago and just as I will in 2 weeks. Some beautiful mantras to evoke the sovereign in you. No one else has power over me. I am the source of my own power and authority. How others behave is none of my concern. And so someone who is in their child is nosy. They need to know everybody's business. I'm going to give a disclaimer here that people in their light archetypes are highly offensive to people in shadow. And there are going to be people who see that offense and go, this has keys for me. And they lean further in. That's the whole model of how I work. I come in, I say a thing, they're like, that's offensive. It must be for me. Let me do the work around that with your support. The example that you gave earlier about the coach who was like, you don't need an NDA for your ideas. They don't mean shit. And you were like, at first I was like, wow, that was really harsh. But then you were like, let me lean in further because there's actually truth here. Someone heard that and they were like, that's really harsh. This isn't the coach for me. And so being in your light archetypes means you're going to have to sacrifice people who are committed to their shadow. Boom, mic drop. All right. Doesn't need any credit or validation. They are the source of personal authority. And I want to be clear that the word authority, I think, is beautiful because it is mostly the word author. And so the authority comes from the ownership you take over authoring your own story, creating and crafting your own vision. They are respected and have a commanding presence. This is not because they're in their bully and they're like, you will respect me. How do I make this person respect me? I coach leaders who they lead teams and they're like, how do I make this person respect me? You don't. You be someone who is worthy of respect and you inspire them to that. But you can't make someone respect you, especially if you don't have respect yourself. And if you struggle with team members not respecting your authority, the call is coming from within the house. You got to look at you and say, where am I not commanding in my presence because I'm not in integrity within? Other people respecting you is a natural progression of you holding integrity and authority. And guys, that's it for the sovereign and the child. And this podcast is potentially a little longer because it's so beautiful and it's something that we're so passionate about. And hopefully it gave you guys a ton of gold to work with. Next week, we're going to be working with the pillar of action, the victim and the warrior. This is the pillar that we encounter people in the most, aside from the saboteur. So the next two pillars are the ones that are most common and show up most often in our coaching containers with leaders, with business owners, and in relationships. So definitely stick around for those. It's going to be absolutely beautiful. We're going to be working with the body and with the mind. And so absolutely delicious.
Looking forward to it.